The police lights flickered through the trees, painting the log walls of my new home in blue and red. I stood on the porch in my robe, coffee cup trembling just slightly. Across the gravel driveway, my son-in-law was shouting, red-faced, pointing at me as if I were the criminal. They thought this would break me. My voice echoed in the quiet chaos. But they had no idea what was coming. Only hours earlier, he'd arrived with a moving truck, his parents smiling proudly behind him, ready to take over the home I'd built after my husband's death. My retirement dream, they called it, as if I were already gone. Now, as an officer approached to ask questions, I kept my calm. My surprise was already in motion, the paperwork, the proof, the cameras I'd installed 2 weeks ago when something in my gut whispered, "They're planning something." The officer glanced at the documents I handed him. His eyes widened. Across the driveway, my son-in-law's shouting faltered. He didn't know it yet, but the house in the woods was no longer his game to win. After my husband died 2 years ago, I thought silence would be my peace. I sold the city house, the one filled with memories and arguments, and bought land deep in the woods. The sound of birds at dawn replaced car horns. Every nail, every tile in that house carried purpose. It wasn't luxury, it was freedom. My daughter Clara visited often at first. She'd bring groceries, stay the weekend, and we'd drink tea on the porch while planning her future. She was engaged to Daniel, polite, charming, with a salesman's smile that never quite reached his eyes. When they married, I thought I was gaining a son. Instead, I'd unknowingly opened the door to a quiet invasion. Daniel liked control. Tiny, invisible strings on everything around him. The first time he visited my home, he commented on wasted potential. "Mom," he said in that smooth voice, "you could rent out the extra rooms. Or, we could build a guest house, expand. This property could earn real money." I laughed it off, not realizing he was serious. Clara's visits grew less frequent. When she came, she'd seem distracted, checking her phone constantly. Daniel started joining, inspecting things like he owned them, testing the faucet pressure, commenting on insulation. Once, he even measured the living room. I asked, half joking, "Planning to move in?" He smiled, "Just planning ahead." That was my first sting. Over time, his suggestions turned to decisions. He brought his parents over for a weekend without asking me first. They arrived with casserole dishes and loud opinions. His mother called the living room quaint. His father said, "We could fix this place up nicely." When they left, the air in the house felt heavier. I found a list on my counter, handwritten in Daniel's neat, confident script. Possible renovations, convert guest room to master, move pantry, repaint. It wasn't a suggestion list. It was a blueprint. Still, I stayed polite. I told myself they meant well. I didn't want to be the difficult mother-in-law. That's what everyone fears becoming, isn't it? The bitter one. The controlling one. Then came the deed conversation. We were sitting on the porch, Daniel, Clara, and me, when he casually asked if I'd added Clara's name to the property deed. "It's just safer, Mom," he said, using that word, Mom, like a tool. "In case something happens to you." I felt my chest tighten. "Nothing's going to happen to me," I said. He smiled. "Of course. But legally, it just makes sense I didn't answer." But that night, I pulled out my husband's old lockbox. Inside was the deed, still in my name alone. I traced the ink with my finger and whispered, "Not yet." Weeks later, I heard from neighbors that Daniel had been telling people they'd soon be living in the woods full-time, that it was a family property. A neighbor even congratulated me on letting the young couple take over. That was the moment something inside me shifted. I started keeping records, every text, every voicemail, every accidental drop-in. I installed small cameras, hidden in birdhouses and behind porch lights. Not because I expected trouble, but because I knew it was coming. The final straw came on Clara's birthday. We had dinner at their house. In front of his parents and a few friends, Daniel made a toast. "To family," he said, "and to new beginnings, in our home in the woods." Everyone clapped. I just stared at my glass, my pulse in my ears. That night I couldn't sleep. The wind howled outside, brushing tree branches against my window. My husband used to say the woods were alive, that they whispered to those who listened. I think I finally heard them that night. They're taking what's yours. And so I began to plan. Quietly, calmly. With a patience Daniel would mistake for weakness, because he thought he'd already won. Daniel's next visit wasn't announced. It was declared. One Saturday morning, I heard the grind of tires on the gravel driveway. By the time I stepped outside, Daniel was already unloading boxes from his truck. His parents stood nearby, waving like they were arriving for a vacation. "Morning, Mom," Daniel said brightly. "We figured we'd start bringing a few things over." I blinked at the word "we." Clara wasn't with them. "I didn't agree to this," I said evenly. He laughed, brushing it off. "Come on, it's just temporary." "My parents' lease ends soon, and your place has space. You won't even notice we're here." I noticed. I noticed every footprint on my floors, every voice echoing through my quiet home. His mother reorganized my kitchen within hours. His father fixed the porch swing I'd built myself, replacing the old chain with a heavier one that clanked like handcuffs in the wind. I wanted to scream, but instead, I smiled. Because the cameras were on. That night, I called Clara. She sounded tired, distracted. "Mom, Daniel's under stress. His parents are struggling financially. Just for a few months, okay?" "Did you know he was moving them here?" I asked. Silence. Then a whisper. "He said you offered." That's when I realized how deep his manipulation ran. He wasn't just taking space, he was rewriting the story, turning me into the generous, forgetful old woman who'd agreed and then changed her mind. The next few weeks were a blur of intrusion. His parents hosted dinners in my house. They invited guests without asking. Daniel replaced my Wi-Fi password and installed a smart home system, claiming it would make things easier. It did. For him. I found out he'd synced it to his phone. Sometimes when I'd walk into a room, the lights would flicker on before I touched a switch. He was always watching. Sleep became impossible. Every sound in the woods felt amplified. The crunch of leaves, the creak of the roof, the faint hum of Daniel's mother's laughter echoing down the hall. I started keeping a notebook, a record of every intrusion, every word. I labeled the pages, date, time, witness, action. But exhaustion has a way of dulling the edges of anger. One night, I broke. I walked to the porch and screamed into the trees. Just once, just enough to feel alive again. That's when I heard a voice from the darkness. "You okay, ma'am?" I turned. A flashlight beam cut through the night. It was the new park ranger, Eli. He was young, quiet, the kind of man who listened more than he spoke. He told me he'd been assigned to patrol the area after complaints about construction noise. "Construction?" I asked. He nodded. "Your family mentioned adding extensions. I thought you'd want to approve it first." That's when I realized Daniel wasn't just moving in, he was expanding. The next morning, I found surveyor flags behind the house. Red plastic markers stabbing into my soil like warnings. Eli helped me file a report for unauthorized work. He explained what Daniel couldn't, how property boundaries worked, how trespassing laws could protect me. He even showed me how to pull title records online. For the first time, I felt something other than fear. I felt direction. That night, I checked the cameras. One had been turned off, another unplugged. I sat in the dark, watching the feed from the last working camera. Daniel standing in the kitchen, flipping through my mail, then pocketing something. My hands shook, but my voice didn't when I whispered into the quiet room, "You just made your last mistake." The next day, I went into town. I made copies, paper and digital, of every recording, every document, every timestamp. I placed them in a folder labeled simply "for police." I didn't know when I'd need it, but I knew I would. By the time Daniel returned that evening, smiling and casual, I had already moved the original deed to a safe place. He poured himself coffee like it was his kitchen. "Mom, you really should relax," he said, chuckling. "You look tired." I met his eyes and smiled back. "I'm just getting started." The letter arrived in a crisp white envelope, thick paper, official seal. Notice of shared residency rights. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Then I saw Daniel's name printed neatly below Clara's. He'd filed a petition claiming partial ownership of the property on behalf of his wife, my daughter. I sat at the kitchen table reading the lines over and over, my pulse pounding. Clara hadn't called. Daniel had gone straight to paperwork. That night, I did call her. She answered on the third ring. "Mom, please don't be angry," she began, voice trembling. "Daniel said it's just a formality, something for taxes. Do you even know what you signed?" Silence. When she finally spoke, she was crying. "He said it would protect us if anything happened to you." That phrase again, "if anything happened to me." It was no longer a suggestion. It was a script. A week later, Daniel showed up in a tailored suit, holding a folder like a trophy. He didn't even knock, just walked in. "Mom," he said, with that slick smile, "I think we should talk about next steps." "The property's too big for you to manage alone," I folded my arms. "You mean too big for you to take quietly." His grin froze. "I'm trying to help." "No," I said softly. "You're trying to own." His parents appeared in the doorway, arms crossed. His father's voice was sharp. "You should be grateful someone's looking out for you." For a moment, I almost laughed. Grateful? For invasion? For theft dressed up as concern? But I didn't lose my calm. I walked to the drawer, pulled out an envelope, and set it on the table. "This is my lawyer's number," I said. "If you have something to say it to him." His expression changed. For the first time, there was a flicker of uncertainty. "Lawyer?" he repeated. "You're making this ugly." I met his gaze evenly. "No, Daniel. You already did." 2 days later, a sheriff's deputy arrived to verify documentation. Daniel had called in a complaint, claiming I was showing signs of confusion. The humiliation stung like acid. Standing on my own porch, being questioned about my mental state, while Daniel and his parents watched from their car, whispering. But I smiled through it. I showed the officer my documents, the title deed, the ID, even a letter from my bank verifying ownership. He nodded, apologized, and before leaving he leaned close and said quietly, "Between you and me, ma'am, this isn't the first time someone's tried to pull this kind of stunt. Don't back down, I didn't." That night, I met with Eli again. We sat on the porch, moonlight glinting off the edge of the woods. I told him everything, the cameras, the paperwork, the fear. He listened without interrupting, then said, "If they're trying to manipulate legal ownership, you need documentation, dates, witnesses, evidence of intent." I smiled faintly. "Already done." I showed him the USB drive. Dozens of files, recordings, texts, and videos. One clip showed Daniel telling a contractor, "Once the old woman's moved into care, we'll start renovations immediately." Eli's eyes darkened. "You have enough here to bury him." But I didn't want to bury him, not yet. I wanted him to feel it, the same helplessness he'd forced onto everyone else. So I waited. Daniel escalated. He started telling neighbors I was paranoid, unstable. His mother began spreading stories in town, how I'd forgotten to pay bills, how I'd invited them to move in. People stopped calling. Even the post office clerk started giving me odd looks. I stayed quiet, collected. Because power doesn't always come from shouting. It comes from patience. When the next letter arrived, this one summoning me to a family meeting arranged by Daniel's attorney, I already had everything I needed. I smiled as I set the letter down on the table beside my coffee. The sunlight glinted off the edge of the USB drive. They thought they still had control, I said softly. They didn't. The family meeting was held at Daniel's house, a modern, sterile box filled with perfect furniture and artificial smiles. Clara sat on one end of the table, eyes red. Daniel and his parents flanked her like guards. A lawyer I didn't recognize shuffled papers with an oily smile. "Thank you for coming, Mrs. Harper," he began. "Please," I said calmly. "Call me Margaret." He cleared his throat. "Margaret, this meeting is purely a formality. Given your age and current stress levels, Daniel and Clara have agreed to help manage your property and finances." "Manage?" I asked. "Or take?" Daniel's grin was subtle, condescending. "You don't have to make this difficult. You've been overwhelmed. This is just to protect you." I looked at my daughter. "Clara, is this what you want?" She couldn't meet my eyes. "Daniel said it's for everyone's good." That was the moment something inside me hardened into steel. I'd spent months doubting myself, trying to play nice, hoping reason would win. But reason doesn't work with people who only understand power. I reached into my bag and set a small recorder on the table. The click echoed like a gunshot. "Before we continue," I said, "I'd like everything documented." For legal purposes, the lawyer's pen froze midair. Daniel's smile faltered. "Why would you need to record this?" he asked. "Because I'm tired of people rewriting my words." The next week, Daniel's campaign went public. He told neighbors I was unstable. He told the HOA president I'd fallen behind on taxes, even called Adult Protective Services, claiming I was living in unsafe conditions. 2 inspectors came. They left apologizing. But the damage spread fast. Whisper networks work better than Wi-Fi. People started looking at me with pity. Or worse, avoidance. That's when I began my campaign. I took Eli's advice seriously. I filed copies of every document with the county clerk. I reported Daniel's construction trespass to zoning authorities. I sent certified letters revoking permission for any non-owner occupancy. Every move I made was quiet, boring, paperwork, not passion. But that's how you win wars, not by shouting, but by writing. Meanwhile, Daniel kept unraveling. His arrogance turned sloppy. He bragged to his friends about taking over the house soon. He forwarded me messages by mistake, revealing he'd already contacted realtors. The symbolic deed, my husband's last signature, became my weapon. I had it sealed, notarized, and backed up digitally. The original went into a safety deposit box. The copy I kept at home, framed and hidden behind my husband's photograph. Weeks passed. Then one morning, I woke to the sound of trucks. Daniel's parents were unloading furniture into my driveway again. When I confronted them, his father just smirked. "Daniel said you'd agreed." "Maybe you forgot." I didn't answer. I simply walked to my porch, picked up my phone, and called the sheriff. "Hello," I said calmly. "I'd like to report trespassing on private property." "I have documentation." It took 20 minutes, but those 20 minutes felt like victory. The officers arrived, checked my ownership papers, and asked Daniel's family to remove their belongings immediately. His mother's face turned scarlet. His father shouted about family loyalty. But Daniel wasn't shouting. He just stood there, pale, jaw tight, because he finally realized his bluff had been called. That night, Clara came alone. No makeup, no pretense, just tears. "Mom," she whispered, "I didn't know he'd go this far." I poured her tea the same way I used to when she was little. You believed what you needed to believe, I said softly. That's what he counts on, your kindness. She looked down ashamed. He said you were losing your memory. I smiled faintly. Then maybe he'll remember what happens when people underestimate me. She stared at me for a long moment. What did you do? I nodded toward the window, where the faint red light of a camera blinked in the distance. I stopped playing defense. By the next week, Daniel's carefully built image began to crumble. The zoning fines arrived. The county records now showed official notices filed against unauthorized changes. Contractors refused to work with him after learning he wasn't on the deed. He started calling me nonstop. Angry voicemails, desperate apologies, sudden kindness. But I saved them all. Every single one. Because the day of reckoning was coming, and no one could stop it. The courtroom smelled faintly of varnish and tension. Wood benches, fluorescent lights, and faces pretending not to stare. Daniel sat across from me, polished and smug in a gray suit. His parents behind him, whispering like vultures. Clara was there too, pale, eyes hollow, caught between loyalty and truth. The judge entered, gavel striking like thunder. Case number 24-117, petition for shared ownership and property rights. Daniel's lawyer stood first, confident. Your Honor, my clients have cared for Mrs. Harper extensively. She verbally offered shared access to her property, then rescinded without cause. We have witnesses to her unstable behavior. I sat quietly, hands folded on my lap. Not once did I interrupt. When it was my turn, my lawyer, a soft-spoken woman named Ruth, stood and said only one sentence. We'd like to present documented evidence of sustained coercion, false claims, and property fraud. The courtroom buzzed. Daniel's smirk twitched. Ruth handed the judge a folder thick with records, timestamps, printed emails, notarized letters, photographs, even video stills from my hidden cameras. The judge flipped through the pages, brow tightening. Then came the audio recordings. Daniel's voice filled the room. Once the old woman's in care, we'll start renovations immediately. Gasps echoed. Someone whispered, My God. Daniel's mother's face drained of color. His father looked ready to stand, but the bailiff's glare stopped him. Ruth continued, calm as stone. Mrs. Harper has maintained all original documentation. She also filed reports with county zoning authorities and the sheriff's department weeks before this petition. Her ownership is uncontested and fully recorded. The judge turned to me. Mrs. Harper, is all of this true? I met his eyes steadily. Yes, Your Honor. I may live alone, but I'm not helpless. I kept records because truth needs witnesses, Daniel finally snapped. She's lying. Those recordings are out of context. Ruth raised a hand. Your Honor, these were obtained legally, time-stamped, stored off-site. Mr. Kent... She gestured toward Eli, seated quietly in the back. Can verify chain of custody. Daniel followed her gaze, and when he saw Eli, uniform pressed, eyes steady, his jaw clenched. For the first time, he looked afraid. The judge leaned back, silent for a moment. Then he said simply, Mr. and Mrs. Kent, you will cease all claims to this property immediately. Further, I'm issuing a restraining order to protect Mrs. Harper from any future harassment or intimidation. This case is dismissed. The gavel struck again. Sharp. Final. Silence. Daniel's parents looked stunned, frozen mid-expression. Clara started to cry quietly, her head in her hands. I stood, gathered my papers, and turned toward the door. Daniel called after me, voice cracking. You think you've won? You turned my wife against me. I paused, then turned just enough for him to see my eyes. No, I said softly. You did that all by yourself. Outside, sunlight flooded the courthouse steps. The same world, but lighter now. Eli stood beside me, hands in his pockets. You okay? He he asked. I smiled faintly, for the first time in a long while. He nodded toward the folder in my hands. What will you do with all that? I looked down at it, my months of fear, proof, patience. I'm going to frame the deed, I said, not to remind me what they tried to take, but what I refused to give. Behind us, Daniel was still shouting, drowned out by the wind. The air smelled like pine and rain. My husband used to say storms leave the air cleaner. I finally understood what he meant. I took a deep breath, steady and full. Then I looked at Eli and said, "Let's go home." The woods were quieter after that day, not because the birds stopped singing, but because my mind finally did. For months, I'd lived in Daniel's noise, footsteps, fake kindness, control. Now there was only wind and peace. I sold his things, reclaimed every corner of my home. A week later, Clara called. "Mom, I left him." I only asked, "Are you safe?" She asked how I stayed calm. "Because anger burns fast," I said. "Patience wins." By summer, silence felt like strength. Wildflowers grew where his red flags once stood. "This house," I whispered, "will never belong to cruelty again." The wind answered softly. It wasn't the end. It was the beginning. They tried to take what wasn't theirs. My peace, my home, my story. But strength doesn't always shout. Sometimes it waits until the storm passes. If someone's ever crossed your boundaries, remember, you don't need to fight like them to win. Because real revenge isn't about getting even. It's about getting free. What would you have done in her place? Tell me in the comments. And remember, silence can be your strongest weapon.